Hello, I'm Alex Polyakov and I run customer solutions at DBOS. Today I'm excited to talk to Devin Stein, the founder of Dosu. Dosu turns your code base into a living knowledge base that every team member can understand, from engineering to operations. The Dosu team have been using DBOS Conductor for a few months now, and also, together, we've applied the Dosu product to the DBOS code base, creating an AI agent that can answer technical questions about DBOS. We're very excited to talk about our journey today. And so, without further ado, Devin, for those who don't know you yet, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about Dosu?
Thank you, Alex. I guess I'm Devin Stein. Um, Alex mentioned, founder of Dosu. Very happy to be here. Also a happy user of DBOS. My background, I've been running Dosu for 2 years now, but I'm an engineer by trade and still feel very much like an engineer. Prior to starting Dosu, I'd been in the machine learning space, but in the automotive industry, and an early engineer at a few different startups. And then outside of work, I'm fairly active in open source. And what put me onto the path to start Dosu is I realized that I spent less and less of my time as an engineer actually coding, but most of my time, especially as I grew more senior and became an expert in the projects I work on, were understanding the code bases and projects and sharing my understanding with other people, whether it's like the community in the open source sense or internally with other stakeholders, both technical and non-technical. And so I started Dosu about 2 years ago to solve that problem, and it's what we're still doing today.
What does the name stand for? I was actually curious about that.
It's a good question. There's a short story and a long story. The short story is Dosu is a play on two words, two things. Do something useful. So Dosu, and then also play on sudo. So super
Ah,
user do super user. The idea was giving less technical people like engineering superpowers.
oh, that's great. Okay, that's great. Uh, do you think you could show it to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go through, a quick example of how to think about Dosu. At the end of the day, Dosu is helping with end-to-end engineering knowledge management, right? So, um, you know, uh, we believe that engineers are the experts at code, and we want to make it as easy as possible for them to get their information into a knowledge base or Dosu as easily as possible as they actually build products. If you think about like documentation and knowledge today, it's sort of an afterthought. You do it and then you document it. But now with LLMs and AI and agents, we're trying to make this more of, think of knowledge and documentation as a byproduct of building.
Hmm.
And so what you're seeing here is an example of a public space. It's our docs, our own documentation, and a really common question we've been getting, especially in the past few months, is does Dosu support an MCP? Do we have an MCP server? And it's an example of that. If you ask Dosu, and is that the answer was no. For um, uh, uh, because we didn't support it. But based off user demand, we started building it out, right? And so, what you know, uh, Dosu kind of like the superpower of Dosu is that it's able to reflect the state of the code base in your knowledge base as you build it out. So here is a PR I have where last week,
Hmm.
implemented an MCP server with the basic functionality around searching kind of the knowledge base and exposing that to agents. And so, as is part of this PR, it's all code. And um, once my PR was merged, Dosu reviewed that PR for potential places in our knowledge base we want to update, and found information about MCP, and then immediately makes the change to our knowledge base once the PRs merge. So the code is committed to the code base, and then the knowledge gets committed back to Dosu's knowledge base. And then the result is something like this, where you see, this FAQ we had around like, hey, does Dosu currently have an MCP or MCP support? And it, was updated to reflect the latest state of the document. And then now, if someone goes and asks Dosu within our public docs, does Dosu support MCP? They will see the correct and most up to date answer, which is yes, we support basic functionality. And this is, one example that is top of mind, but it's a really, I guess, powerful workflow for thinking about both internal support, so like, engineering, onboarding, internal Q&A, like how you document software, as well as like customer facing knowledge articles, because the, uh, ever problem, like for as long as documentation existed, the problem has been like, how do you actually keep things in sync with code? And, historically, the best answer was, document your add your documentation as close to the code as possible. So, it's easier for engineers to remember. But that was limiting for non-engineers or less technical people or other knowledge bases. And so now we're in this world where we can actually connect and relate external knowledge back to the code. And so, it actually keeps up to date. So I'll pause
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, so it looks like there's a couple of different agents here. There's one agent, correct me if I'm wrong, that looked at your MCP PR and suggested this FAQ change. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And then there's another agent that you can chat with that will give you up-to-date answers based on the contents of the FAQ.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a kind of a research a chat agent for that will look at your knowledge base and give you answers. It'll also do research if it can't find the answer, look at like your connected data sources. So if it doesn't have access, let's say it can't find the information in the knowledge base, it'll then fall back to look through your other connected data sources. So maybe your code base, recent PRs, discussions in Slack,
Mm,
as well. And that's on kind of the ask side. And then on the other side is on the maintenance side, we have, a documentation update agent, which will review your PR and look for updates, like how should it update docs, similar to like, a coding agent updating code. And then there's another interaction pattern, which, I didn't show here, but also in Slack. Slack is a really common place where knowledge is shared or decisions are made. And so you can also interact with the Dosu agent there in both modalities. So either asking questions or, saving information back to the knowledge base.
very cool. Very cool. So let's go under the hood and talk about what makes this machinery work. What does your tech stack look like now?
So we have, you know, agents generally are, it's both like, a very interesting and technical problem on like many dimensions. One is you're working with LLMs, which are probabilistic systems, and you're trying to wrangle them to be more deterministic,
Mm,
on one hand. And the other side is they're also, relatively slow, in software terms. Asking an LLM, especially when you're working with large amounts of data, can take minutes, sometimes hours, depending on the types of tasks. So we have both like non-deterministic sort of, or rather like sometimes unreliable workflows that we have to orchestrate, and they're fairly long running. And
Not
that's only on the inference side.
that almost sounds like humans, like those two traits, right? Like non-deterministic gives me random output and also takes its time, right? That's kind of an interesting observation.
I agree. I think the analogy between, sometimes it's dangerous to make too many analogies between
Yeah.
LLMs and humans, but it's uncanny in a lot of ways. Like there's a lot of thinking about the way humans do things and then translating that to LLMs is actually very useful. Um, but there's things that LLMs are better at, like they can consume a lot more information much faster.
Mm.
But then there's things that humans are better at, which is more around like the nuances.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm. Okay, so what does the tech stack look like to address those limitations?
Yeah. So that's on the inference side. On the indexing side, it's we're also ingesting a bunch of data that we're making searchable, and kind of connecting back to the code base. And so we're doing a lot of index time work, as well. So there's kind of always like a background indexing pipeline going, and then there's the
Mm,
inference on events. So every time a PR is opened, every time someone asks a question, from a tech stack perspective, we are on GCP. We are, everything is serverless through Cloud Run. And so we have different internal services for different purposes. And then, we're heavily Postgres. We use Superbase for Postgres, for kind of users, and permissioning through RLS. And then we use Postgres for a lot of kind of general backend work. And then on the orchestration layer, I'm sure we'll talk about, we've been using DBOS to help orchestrate those long running workflows for both the agent side as well as the indexing workflows.
mm. That's perfect. So, what uh did it look like before DBoss? Let's go there, right? So before you decided to make the switch, what was it like, and what did it look like to transition?
Yeah. I'll start. I'll go maybe rewind very far to like the beginning of Dosu. So when we started, Dosu's always been sort of a deep research agent, so it's always been fairly long running. And Cloud Run has a limitation on synchronous endpoints for like push events of 10 minutes.
Mm, mm,
And so we were always bottlenecked by 10 minutes as like the longest we could do any task. And we were also bottlenecked on like max connections you could hold open on Cloud Run, some of their like concurrency restrictions. And so we were trying to find like, okay, what is something that can help us orchestrate these long running workflows better, and also help us parallelize work more. As many people know, async Python and parallelism Python is difficult, especially async IO. There's a lot of foot guns, and with like native threads too, the code gets very kind of hard
mhm,
to read and
mhm,
confusing, and hard to reason about. So we went and looked for potential solutions. We looked at temporal, for the kind of extreme of durable workflow execution, and then we also looked at a few others and ended up choosing actually Celery as
mhm,
our initial like async queue orchestration framework. And so we migrated to Celery. And what Celery did well is it helped us parallelize things and like very cheaply. It had a nice decorator pattern that made it easy for us to convert things into tasks that would then we could spin up a bunch of tasks, not have to worry about like concurrent connections, and all of the complexity of kind of the pub sub cloud run model we had. But where it really started to break down is for longer running workflows. Study
mm,
is really good if you want to just spin off a bunch of tasks. But in our case, our tasks are really dependent on each other. And for that to work well at Celery, you have to define these like long, kind of complicated chords and canvases and groups. And from both internally, it was very hard for us to reason about. It also required us to kind of have a bunch of new infrastructure. We need to, run VMs on Compute Engine. We needed a Redis, highly available Redis broker,
mm,
and so it introduced a lot of new tooling for the team.
mm,
And yeah, and so we kind of tried to run with that, and we kept running into issues around observability and then friction on like these, kind of the flexibility we wanted on the workflow level. A really good example is like onboarding onto Dosu. When a user onboards, they connect their GitHub repository and other data sources, and we want to do a bunch of work that's all dependent on each other and is, ultimately one very long workflow, but can take hours depending on the size of the project. So we need to index their data. We need to
mm,
do topic and like data analysis on it. We want to surface some of that information back to users, wait for their input, and then kick off new jobs to run the agent to give them example responses and maybe suggest initial documentation and then generate those documents. And that was, I mean, essentially impossible to express in Celery. We built some primitives to try and make it possible, and those were not very reliable. And then we saw DBOS. It was, I think, on Hacker News when we first discovered it. And what was really exciting about it was one, it was open source and also like very easy to understand. And it was Postgres backed. And like I said, we're already heavily using Postgres. So from a technology perspective, we like there's nothing we needed to do. And then the kind of big third one was just the um, it offered a similar kind of decorator pattern that Celery
Mm.
offered, but with much better, like, durability and workflow, like, long-running workflow guarantees. Instead of, having to write, chords and chains and groups, to write a workflow, you just write Python functions, it has workflow and it has steps, and, you add some decorators, and it just works. So, yeah.
Mm. So at that point, was that a quick sell, so to speak? Did you just decide to go with DBOS right away, or did you kick off an evaluation and look at a few things?
We kicked off an evaluation primarily to look at DBOS. The obvious kind of like sort of incumbent in the space was Temporal, but we're a small startup. We're about 10 people. And, part of the reason we were having issues with Celery was because of the complexity of the infrastructure. And, there's a very steep learning curve on Temporal as well.
Mhm.
And so we wanted to try use DBOS and like run a proof of concept. What was interesting, and I guess I left out, is we actually built a sort of a framework trying to overcome some of the shortcomings of Celery that had some similarities to DBOS, and that we were logging workflow execution state to Postgres table, which helped us
Mhm.
observe information. And so we were excited about the similarities there. And so we started by migrating a few non-critical like user-facing workloads to DBOS, really trying to understand, can this thing scale to our kind of current state, and how far can we push it? And then, like, operationally, how will this change our lives? Will it actually help us with the monitoring, observability, and so we kind of went through that process of not just testing out functionally, like what would it like look like to build on DBOS, but then what would it look like to do this operationally as well.
Mhm. Mhm. So you start the migration, and I guess it sounds like it looked like something that you would build yourself and maybe started building, right? And that was one of the selling points, I think, right? I heard that quote before earlier this week. And so, all right, and so you decide to start moving to DBOS, and you mentioned slowly. You pick up one workflow and you migrate it, and then you pick up another one, and I suppose the architecture was conducive to that gradual migration. And as this process continues, what were the challenges there? Any issues you bumped into? What wasn't clear, or what were some of the obstacles?
So there were some learnings along the way. I think from a purely operational perspective, or rather, uh, like tactically or functionally, migrating to DBOS turned out to be very easy because we had the infrastructure in place. We had a Postgres, and actually a fairly large Postgres instance already. And writing the DBOS workflows is really easy. Like converting it from Celery to DBOS or writing a new one was trivial from an implementation perspective. And so that was great. The challenges or issues we ran into, the learnings along the way, there's some specific stuff with Cloud Run.
Mm.
By default, Cloud Run bills based off CPU time, meaning only when workers are active. But that means they shut CPUs down when you don't have an ongoing request. And because DBOS is operating and running workflows in the background, they would be, get killed because the CPUs would get shut down until a new request would come in. and we're trying to figure out what's going on. And so,
Mm,
switching that setting on a Cloud Run so CPUs are always on rather than only allocated during requests, fix that. And so there were a few learnings like that. And then the next was on the observability side. And so, Conductor helped a lot with that, helping us see, what is going on with each workflow. What is the status? Visualizing workflows is also actually really, really nice, something we couldn't do before.
right.
And then on top of that, like figuring out how to debug it when things went wrong. And so the nice thing about being in Postgres and being having a team that's comfortable working in Postgres is we often just look right at the system tables and have built a bunch of utilities for inspecting inputs of workflows to find ones that we know failed and like what was the input, what was the error message, and have built actually more observability around basically flagging when a workflow fails. Is it a workflow that we care about, like it needs to succeed, like the onboarding workflow, and then tooling around resuming workflows and having some internal notebooks for those more operational things.
Hmm. Hmm. I see. And as the DBOS footprint expanded, were you able to measure an impact? Were you able to say that yes, indeed, this was worth the investment and worth the change? And what would you say is the biggest impact of the switch?
There are intangible, benefits or more, like things we feel in terms of simplicity um, of not just like the code and the infrastructure. So being able to actually understand and read through workflows
Mm,
versus understanding how having to understand celery concepts and then figure out how things are moving, like onboarding. Like there's a just has been easier for people to jump into new parts of the code base and understand without having to get ramped up on a bunch of concepts. Um, the impact on the observability side, I think, has been huge. Like being able to see clearly, and almost now that we run so much of our workflows through DBOS, you know, outside of Sentry, it is sort of our log of what has failed and what are the issues and what's going on. So we have a lot better, like basically statistics on how things fail, why things fail, when things fail, which has been really, really huge. And then, like, tangibly simplifying our infrastructure, I mean, we've saved
mm,
actually a significant amount of money by not needing, as much infrastructure, both on the Redis and compute engine side.
mm,
We've been able to consolidate our infrastructure really around Postgres and Cloud Run, and now are in a position where we're sort of just scaling those, vertically, essentially, or adding new executor nodes to DBoss whenever we need a bit more capacity. And that's been working really well. And it's like nice to be in a place where it feels like we can scale this infrastructure for the
mm,
foreseeable future in a very simple way. There's not
mm,
like too much complexity. And Cloud Run is pretty cost effective. And so that's been a huge from savings on both engineering time, but also like actually on infrastructure costs.
mm. Yeah, I think the word simple is the word I keep hearing over and over again, repeating, right? It's simpler architecture and simpler um, uh, code wise, right? And you got to imagine that translates to developer productivity increases, but it's hard to find teams that measure that rigorously, right?
Yeah, and it's very hard to measure developer I mean, there's companies dedicated to developer productivity. How do you evaluate that?
Yeah.
But it's also something that you kind of intuit. You can feel that, hey, you jump into something, and is it easy for me to kind of build new things, and more importantly, change things that exist, and then like understand how that is and test it. Um, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So as you're scaling up, are things just completely smooth, no issues whatsoever, or were there things to learn? Were there growing pains, and what were they?
So there were some interesting growing pains, not necessarily related to DBoS, that I think we had some back and forth on, but because we were putting more load on Postgres, it ended up unearthing some other just patterns in our code base that were putting excessive load on Postgres, because now we had more load, and all of a sudden, like the little bugs we had were now more observable. Actually, they're like, okay, well, why is this query for DBOS taking this amount of time? Um, and and so it actually unearthed some other bugs we had, and so kind of cutting through those, things have actually been very, very smooth recently.
Mm,
Um, Another thing that was interesting was there were places where we were very inefficient in terms of doing running workflows and queuing workflows where there was no work to be done. Right? It was just like basically look at something and then it's like, oh, I don't need to do work, end the workflow. And that puts a bunch of load for no reason, especially like at our scale where we have
mm,
tens of thousands of
mm,
projects that
mm,
we're indexing regularly. And so uh, being and like we previously had to do that because our celery primitives didn't make it easy for us to find these kind of more complex workflows, and also like in queuing different workflows from other workflows. And now with DBOS, we've just been more like efficient in terms of like how we um, uh, index and just trigger workflow. So instead of like, hey, we're going to check all 60,000 data sources at once or every hour or every 5 minutes, we're going to have like a longer indexing workflow that then enqueues something in the future. Because we've had better primitives, we would actually be able to be smarter about
mhm.
how we define things.
So did you end up having to get a bigger Postgres?
No, it's been holding
Okay.
up. It's fairly beefy, but I think it could be bigger. Something that is also interesting to us as we continue to scale out DBOS is, and maybe useful for other folks is, we are in GCP, but we use Supabase, and so it's not in the same VPC as
Mm,
our executor nodes, and that it's still like fairly fast queries, but we know that if we have our DBOS Postgres instance in the VPC, a performance would be significantly, significantly faster. So that's something that we're thinking about. At like, what point does it make sense to maybe pull the DBOS part of our Postgres out and just have something in the VPC in GCP? And what's nice is that's actually really easy to do. And so that's something we've been thinking about as like a future for helping scale it more. But right now, it's handling our workflows really well.
I see. And so what's next for you guys as you scale, as you keep growing? What do you think the next set of challenges to tackle is?
There's a lot of challenges. So like on the technical side, on both the product and like infrastructure, we are really, our goal is to make it as easy as possible for people to maintain, generate, and share knowledge, right? And so we've been building out different agents to make that possible. Like we talked about, we have our existing ones for um, uh, asking questions and doing research, and then updating documentations. We're kind of expanding the scope of the documentation update agent to make it more akin to maybe a traditional coding agent, where instead of just making an update to a single document at a time, it can make kind of sweeping changes really efficiently.
Mm,
And almost thinking about your knowledge base as a bit of a code base for it to like collaborate on. And then we're also working on other background agents for essentially attaching metadata to your knowledge base for you. So, how do you visualize the connections from like this piece of documentation to, the code files? Or like what parts of your repository are related to this piece of documentation and who's the owner and all this additional metadata? Can we like kind of pull that in and make that more present? And then on the infrastructure side, supporting all of that is always interesting. Yeah, so that's like kind of what's been going on there. Like I guess I showed in the demo, but MCP support and generally like an interesting kind of part of Dosu is, we ended up building this knowledge base because we needed it for Dosu and is LLMs are only as good as the information they have access to, and so
Mhm.
pretty much any LLM benefits or agent benefits from a high quality knowledge base. And so we've been thinking a lot about how can we make Dosu a knowledge provider for Cursor, Cognition's Devin, Claude Code, other coding agents, other internal tools that maybe people have built as well. And so thinking about what is the relationship there and the best ways to expose tools and information back to other agents.
Sounds like a full and exciting roadmap, right? A
Yes.
lot of things you have planned. What do you think you'll need from DBOS to make those things happen? Feature requests.
Feature requests. Well, I actually saw you. We haven't implemented yet, but
Mm,
one of the things that I really was excited to see is the debounce API.
mm, mm,
That is something that we've actually like really wanted, and I think could have maybe built, but it was a little complex. We're like, and so we're excited to try out the debounce API. Another little tip that we found that maybe was really helpful for us is a way of we want to do like throttling on a specific workflow. Like I want to run
mm,
this workflow at most once per hour, or once
mhm,
per every 15 minutes or one day. And so a little trick there is just appending, having an item potency key or deduplication ID on the DBoS workflow and appending the timestamp to it.
mm,
So it's like, it's for this date or it's for this hour,
mm,
or this, part of, 5 minute block of this hour, has been like a really convenient and clean way for us to do that, like that sort of throttling behavior, which is cool. Um, and then outside of that, I think like my main DBoS request is really just on the operations side. I think so. Thinking more about uh, you know, versioning actually is something also we didn't talk too much about, like application
mm,
versioning and DBoS and how we can, better monitor and like version workflows. And like right now, we were relying on the default behavior of, what is it? It computes a hash based off the workflow code. And now we've reverted to like the more primitive, which is we just have a static version that we manually
mm.
maintain. And so some tooling around workflow versions and operations there, I think, would be helpful. Right now, it's best effort for us. Um, and then otherwise, I think that's it, at least top of mind.
Yeah, the versioning is a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. There was a PR that went in yesterday, I think, that makes the version accessible to the app code. So there's a dboss.app version global now that you can access from the code directly. So you can use that to tell what version you're running and compare that to what the database says. Um,
Interesting.
but let's dive into that for just a little bit, maybe. Talk to me about how you handle upgrades and what's working well and what would you like to see more of in that area.
So right now, we try and maintain backwards compatibility. It's basically like best effort. And then if something is not backwards compatible, just write into your workflow is usually rather
Mm,
than trying to like update an existing one has been our approach right now. Um, the we have done some like operations that actually would be maybe an interesting piece to explore is um, how to make it easier to resume and fork workflows, like APIs there. Sometimes working with like the serialized input format can be complicated for
mm,
workflows. And so I don't know exactly what the requests would be there, but I think the operations for like, hey, maybe I added this new parameter and I want to add, like update the inputs, all these old ones to have that parameter set to none or something like that. It's a contrived example, but some operations on the input side could be interesting and helpful because right now some of that is us basically evaluating like do we care about these workflows to go through the manual ops to resume or fork them? Um, I think that would be that's like an example of something. I think for me, I mean, I'm biased, but like I really like having stuff on PRs. And so anything that, maybe DBoS through Conductor could provide, giving us some information on pull requests that we should be aware of. Maybe like, hey, this is going to change this application version, or yeah,
Mm,
something like that. Or even just like linking to like the touched workflows impacted by this PR could be helpful just to make that information like top of mind for developers.
mm,
And then generally like observability, is always useful.
that's great. Great requests. Great things to think about. We'll talk more about those, I'm sure. Um, so as we're slowly running out of time here, as a final thought, for someone who hasn't encountered DBoS before, what would you tell them about DBoS?
It depends. I think, like, I mean, for sort of my tagline in my head, it's like, durable execution made simple,
Mhm.
or like, durable execution for the masses, in
Mm,
some ways, because I think that's the big thing that I love about DBoS and its approach is that, most people don't need like an insanely powerful, like, workflow execution framework like Temporal. Like most, like vast majority of companies don't. And that's the thing that's always been compelling about Postgres and why Postgres popularity is like most of the time you just need Postgres. And sometimes you don't, but like most of the time you just need Postgres. And I feel the same way about DBoS is like most of the time you just need DBoS. And the reality is with LLMs and agents becoming just like the foundation of software. I think everything needs a durable execution framework or pattern, whether they know it or not.
mm,
And so I think having something simple like DBoS is should be a no-brainer for any kind of modern agent stack, in my opinion.
So well put, Devin. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, and finally, where can people find you online and where can people find Dosu?
You can find me on Twitter. I think my handle is devstein64. And then Dosu as well. We're Dosu underscore AI on Twitter, LinkedIn. Join our Discord as well. If you are excited about kind of building the future of how people think about knowledge internally, come join and chat about it.
Yes, pleasure and an honor to work with you, Devin, and thanks so much for your time today.
Likewise, Alex. Appreciate you having me on.
All right.